Hey, from Europe to China to the United States, there are changes in the air which have led to political forces around the world leaning away from the long-standing trends of globalization. Recent evidence indicates that for the first time in over a century, we're now entering a period of slowbalization, where the overall economic activity around the globe is actually slowing down. Today on LokadTV, we're going to learn a little bit more about this concept and understand what it can actually mean for some of the supply chains in the world. So Johannes, slowbalization sounds like a fairly interesting concept. So what's the basic idea behind this?
So it was a term coined by an author writing for The Economist that was describing indeed a relatively recent trend of, I would say, of worldwide commerce, of having a slowdown of the amount of exchanges that happen internationally. It's not actually, I mean, despite the super recent event with Trump battling with tariff with China, it's not that recent. I mean, I did found a report from the IMF 2 years ago that pointed out that basically the turn point was in 2012. I mean, for the 3 decades prior, global trade had been growing twice as fast as global GDP. So that means that, that when your country was getting 10% richer, it would actually exchange 20% more with its neighbors. And this process had been going on, at an accelerated rate for the last 3 decades. And it entered a turn point where basically the growth was first growing, trade was growing just as fast as the growth in global GDP, but not faster. So basically there were more exchanges, but just because the countries were richer, not because they were having, I would say, more intensity in the trade. And this it's now growing slower than the growth of the countries, hence this slowbalization term.
Okay, and you sort of mentioned there a little bit about Trump and tariffs. And what are kind of the external effects that have kind of led to this sort of slowdown, would you say?
I mean, it is, according to the studies I've read. Obviously, I'm not an absolute expert in this sort of matters, but it's a wild combination of factors. I mean, one is just that the cost of manufacturing goods have been going down and keeps going down, which means that in terms of trade, if you have, you're always paying, let's say, your physician or your haircutter the same price, but the products that you buy at the supermarket are going down, then in terms of relative proportion of spending, the monies that you spend on goods that are imported from overseas just decrease, not necessarily because you're buying less stuff, but just because those stuff is actually cheaper. So having, I would say, an ongoing decrease of production cost actually is lowering that. Also, there has been like an ongoing decrease of transportation cost, although this now is relatively stable. That is just the cost of containers for cargo shipment, which is nowadays very low and is actually staying low. And you have also, I would say, indeed, other effects, which is, it's a bit of a paradox, is that the increase of automation and the productivity gains are kind of averaging out, the countries in terms of opportunity to produce. If you have a factory that requires no worker whatsoever, it doesn't really matter whether you're producing in Bangladesh or in the US, just because it's the cost to buy and set up the factory, which is kind of a global price. And then if the operating cost is just the same, no matter where you put your factory, then all that matters is to be very close to where things get consumed in the end. It's interesting because for now a couple of decades, I mean, some industries were ahead of others, but for example, the automotive industries for decades has been following a strategy of having factories producing locally for the local markets.
And this kind of reduction in production costs and transport costs, is this a trend that's really going to continue, or is it at some point we're going to reach as far as we could go with kind of the reduction in these costs?
In terms of automation, I think we still have, I mean, it's the productivity in terms of has increased tremendously on the production side. So yet there are some industries that are still involving having a fair amount of manual labor, fashion, for example, textile. It's yet even that is getting more and more automated. So, so for example, I mean, now from Asia, one of the big things that gets imported from Asia is textile, and probably thanks to the progress of automation on one side and the increase of tariff on the other side, there will be, in the decade to come, a rebalance of having production closer to the markets where the products are consumed, which will, I would say, decrease in volume the amount of international trade, at least relatively to the global GDP. That might, in the meantime, keeps increasing.
So what's kind of changing then? Why are these kind of local supply chains suddenly being so much more advantageous? Why is it becoming something that's so much more easy to work with?
I mean, again, it's a matter of having better, I would say, more productivity in the production facilities. So that means that the competitive edge that you have in producing in a low-cost country is diminished, relatively to produce to a more expensive country like the USA or Germany. And then I believe, again, that we are, from what I witness, is that there are many industries that are now fairly mature, where things are not necessarily evolving as dramatically as they used to in the past, which means that you have to compete on having, more diversified offer, more options, which is tons of, I would say, supply chain complication. For example, when Apple decide that instead of having 2 colors for the iPhone, they are going to have 20, then that means that they need to have like 20 more reference that they need to keep in stock, that they need to rebalance the stock across the network and everything. And obviously, whenever you add more options, you extend your ranges of products, then it creates a lot more complications to execute that plan. And again, if you have a supply chain that is more local, where you have lead times are shorter, where you don't need to take as much risk because you don't need to forecast that far ahead in the future, that really helps to execute this sort of plan of more diversified offer, of fitting closer to the demand.
Okay, so obviously having a local supply chain has got its benefits. Are there any sort of challenges that it also introduces?
Absolutely. I mean, if you want to see, having producing very far was also meaning had also as a consequence that many decisions were done less frequently. If you pass 2 large bulk orders to your Chinese providers every year, if you're reordering every 6 months, and every time you reorder, you pass 1 large purchase order, then in terms of, I would say, quantitative supply chain optimization, you don't have that many decisions to optimize. So that means that you don't necessarily need, I would say, sophisticated support. I mean, support from sophisticated software to support those decisions, because as you're taking those decisions relatively infrequently, you can actually invest a lot of human time on those decisions. If you switch from passing 2 purchase orders a year to your Chinese supplier to making, I would say, 1 purchase decision a week to a local supplier, then suddenly you are spending, an orders of magnitude more time. If you want to put the same amount of brain time, you're spending 10 times as much human time on the case to do the same thing. So that gives you, I would say, a strong incentive to get support from sophisticated software, so that you can bring a high degree of automation to the decision process itself, not just the production.
Yeah, it makes sense. And how about sort of environmental considerations? Is that potentially having an impact, why it's sort of making a little less sense to kind of ship goods from one side of the world to another now?
I mean, obviously, yes. If you transport, the more transportation involved, I would say, the more waste you generate through transportation. However, I mean, there are few people, I think, that realize how efficient is cargo shipment through the sea. You know, if it's a bit mind-blowing, but basically, if you want to think of what is the engine power that you have on a cargo ship, that would be the equivalent of, imagine, the electrical engine that you have for an electrical bike, and imagine having the same engine but for a truck instead. And that is kind of, the ratio of what you have for a cargo ship. So that, by the way, that explains why it literally takes days to reach, cruise speed, and why it takes like 150 kilometers to bring your ship to a halt, is that you have very, very little power. I mean, they have very big engines, but compared to the size of the cargo ship itself, it's very, very small. And in terms of energy consumption, they are incredibly efficient. But I believe that the bulk of the inefficiency is not actually in the fact that you have to spend power to transport the goods. It's just that the fact that you need like 10 weeks of transportation times, it means that it opens, plenty of room to make mistakes, in the sense that you are producing something that ultimately the market doesn't need, just because you have added, 10 extra weeks of lead times. And so if when the cargo ship arrives to port, you end up having to, literally discard half of what you've produced because it's not actually fitting what the market needs anymore, then you end up with a massive, amount of waste. And I believe that it's hard to compute, but I suspect that the waste are more on the overstock, understock part than it is on the pure, I would say, energy part for transportation, at least as far cargo shipment are concerned. When it comes to transporting goods through aircraft, obviously it's a completely different matter, because aircraft consumes, a lot more energy and fuel than cargo ship. I mean, if you count in terms of kilograms of stuff that you want to move around, or cubic meters of goods that you want to move around.
Yeah, and sort of globalization has really sort of changed the way that a lot of companies kind of operate. It's sort of spread new technology around the globe, and companies are now operating across hundreds of countries. How does you see sort of slowbalization changing the way that those companies kind of act?
That's a very interesting question, because from what I see, even if the amount of trade in dollars is going down for just the reasons that we mentioned, I can still see that many companies are more globalized than ever. And if I look at, I know within our clients that we have probably something like a dozen of companies that are right now considering, a project one for another of having one ERP to rule them all. So there is still, I would say, a lot of companies that are aiming for that. And in contrast, I do not see any of our clients that would have the opposite plan, which says, oh, we have one ERP, we want to split that into one ERP per country. So it's interesting, even if the amount of trade is slowing down between countries, the companies that operate, across many countries are still investing a lot of efforts to bring some kind of uniformity across all their operation at a global scale, and thus to have like one applicative landscape to rule them all. I mean all the countries, even if physically each supply chain happened to be more local. And when I say local, we are still talking about literally continents. So it's like North America, Europe, and Asia, and maybe India. We are still talking of having blocks of 500 million people. So it's local, just in the sense that you're only talking about like 500 million people markets, instead of thinking like five or even 7 billion people markets. So
okay, so what we're saying is these kind of companies are very kind of interdependent on kind of the different countries, and they're sort of, it's very difficult for them to kind of work on their own
exactly. I mean, that's the point, is that even in terms of interdependency, the thing that is interesting is that I believe that the world is still heading for more and more dependencies between countries. Even if China and the US are putting, a lot of tariff in between. It's very interesting because, for example, most of the software that are, used in China to operate everything is still based on, US production. So you see, whenever they have probably, in China, I would say it's a rough estimate, but something like probably 80-90% of the servers are now, run on Linux, which is, I would say, completely driven by North American companies, much more than being driven by, I would say, Chinese companies. And if you look at American companies, they are extensively leveraging, computing hardware that was manufactured in Asia. So, and even if there is tariff in between, I do not see that, changing anytime soon. And I believe that actually it's still accelerating. So there is like those, even if you have tariff and you have less stuff that moves physically from one country to another, I would say from an organizational level or technological level, I can see that the amount of dependencies that you have worldwide is still increasing.
It's a really interesting concept, isn't it, that you can have this kind of dependency on so many different kind of countries. So what's maybe from a Lokad perspective, what are we kind of dependent on?
I mean, Lokad, we are incredibly dependent from stuff that are done super far from our headquarters here in Paris. I mean, we depend from open source projects that are developed by people literally pretty much all over the world. But I believe that we are gradually becoming even more tightly coupled in many subtle ways. For example, for all our clients who are now using cloud ERPs, let's say, for example, NetSuite, it's not just being dependent on the fact that we are, getting a copy from an open source software that we put into Lokad and that then let us run Lokad. If we, for example, we have an integration with a web ERP, it means that we have like real-time dependency with vendors that are super far from us. And it's tight coupling, and it's coupling where it's subtle, but both Lokad and, for example, NetSuite invest in this coupling. NetSuite invest in making their API better, faster. They keep improving on their on opening themselves to a wide array of partners. And Lokad, we keep investing on actually having better connectors to leverage those APIs when they are available. So in a way, we are tightening the dependencies. We are making them stronger over time through those investments.
Okay. If we start sort of bringing things together now, in terms of slowbalization, is this kind of a trend that you can see continuing, or would you say this is just a little blip and we're going to go back to very much kind of that globalization approach, which has been done so well over the last few decades?
No, I believe that it's going to be a lasting trend. Also because fortunately the standard of living in Asia are rising rapidly, which means that China was incredibly competitive while the labor was super cheap. As China becoming richer, this advantage is thinning, which means that you won't have such a competitive edge, in outsourcing things to China, for example. And I believe that it's like the fact that China has been getting richer. I mean, obviously, you have economic cycle. They might have like a big bubble on the housing market that might go burst, and so they might actually have a recession for a while. I don't know. I'm not, I can't predict exactly what will happen in China for the next couple of years. But I believe, that overall China is getting richer, and that's not going to change, in the short term. So that means that the force that are driving this globalization will be there. And just as we had like 3 decades straight of, I would say, of globalization that was becoming more and more intense, I would not be surprised if the globalization is something that is, going, that again, IMF was counting that it did start, the pivotal year was like 2012. I would not be surprised if this globalization trend, lasts for a couple of decades. After that, I just don't know. I don't think that anybody knows. But I think that the driving force are stable, and there is no reason to expect any kind of reversing trend. And also, I don't believe that, for example, tariff as orchestrated by trend will do more than just a small acceleration of what is otherwise a lasting trend on that.
I'm going to have to wrap it there, but thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Okay, that's everything for today. Thanks very much for tuning in, and we'll see you again on the next episode. Bye for now.